The paper trembled in his hands, not from fear, though fear was there, not from the Texas wind rattling through the processing center, though the wind was blowing. The paper trembled because Carl Schneider, prisoner of war number 37429, was about to make a decision that would cost him everything he had ever known. It was May 1945. Germany had surrendered. The war was over. And on this form, in careful English, he had learned to read over 2 years of captivity, were the words that should have meant freedom, repatriation, return to homeland, expected departure, June 1945. But Carl was not thinking about Germany. He was thinking about a girl with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands who had taught him that the enemy could look you in the eye and see a human being. He was thinking about the way she laughed when he fumbled with a lasso, the way she corrected his English without mockery, the way she had stood between him and her father's anger and said simply, "He is a good man." He was thinking about a daughter of Texas who had changed everything. The American officer behind the desk cleared his throat. "Son, you need to sign. The ships are loading next month." Carl looked down at the paper. One signature, and he would return to Hamburg, to rubble, to starvation, to a family he had not seen in 3 years and might not even be alive. One signature, and he would never see her again. His hand moved toward the pen, then stopped. "Is there," he began in halting English, "is there another way?" To understand how Carl Schneider ended up holding that paper, you have to go back 2 years. Back to the summer of 1943, when he stepped off a transport truck in Central Texas and thought he had arrived in hell. Not the hell of fire and punishment the propaganda had promised. A different kind of hell. One that made no sense. Carl had been captured in North Africa. Tunisia, to be exact. Rommel's Afrika Korps had been crushed by the Allies, and Carl, barely 20 years old, had found himself among thousands of German soldiers being shipped across the Mediterranean, then across the Atlantic. He had expected death, or something close to it. The Nazi officers had been very clear. Americans were barbaric. They would torture prisoners, starve them, force them into labor camps where they would be worked to death. Carl had written what he thought was a final letter to his mother before boarding the transport ship. "I do not expect to survive," he had written. "Remember me with love." But the transport ship had not sailed to his death. It had sailed to Houston, and from Houston he had been loaded onto a train with barred windows that rolled north through a landscape that seemed to stretch forever. Fields of cotton, endless plains, small towns with white churches and American flags, and everywhere, a sense of space that made Germany feel like a cramped closet. Through those barred windows, Carl saw no bomb craters, no burned-out buildings, no starving refugees, just abundance, farms full of crops, cattle by the thousands. And he began to understand, with a sinking feeling in his stomach, that everything he had been told was a lie. The train stopped at Camp Swift, just outside of Austin. It was one of the largest prisoner of war camps in Texas, holding thousands of German soldiers in rows of identical wooden barracks, surrounded by barbed wire and guard towers. But even here, the strangeness continued. The guards did not beat them. They were given clean uniforms, real beds, and food. So much food. That first meal, Carl sat staring at his tray. Beef stew, bread with butter, vegetables, coffee, more food than he had seen in months at the front. Around him, other prisoners ate in stunned silence. One man began to cry. Another whispered, "This cannot be real." But it was real. And over the following weeks, Carl learned the rules of his new life. The Geneva Convention governed their treatment. They would be housed, fed, and given medical care. They would work, yes, but they would be paid a small wage in canteen tokens. They could write letters home, attend religious services, even organize camp activities. It was captivity, certainly. The barbed wire was real. The guard towers were manned. But it was a captivity that felt less like punishment and more like waiting. Waiting for the war to end. Waiting to go home. Waiting for something neither Carl nor anyone else could quite name. In the fall of 1943, Carl and about 40 other prisoners were selected for a work detail. The guards loaded them into trucks and drove them west, out past the edge of Austin into the rolling hill country where cattle ranches sprawled across thousands of acres. They stopped at a ranch owned by a man named William Hayes. Bill Hayes was in his 50s, a third-generation Texan who had built his operation from a few hundred head of cattle into one of the larger spreads in the county. His sons were overseas, one in Europe, one in the Pacific. His ranch hands had been drafted, and his cattle still needed tending. The prisoners climbed down from the trucks into the blinding Texas sun. Carl had thought North Africa was hot, but this was different. A heavy, wet heat that soaked through clothes and made every breath feel like work. Bill Hayes stood waiting, a tall man in a sweat-stained hat and boots worn smooth with age. He looked the prisoners over with an expression that gave nothing away. Then he spoke, slow and clear so the translator could keep up. "You boys are here to work, not to cause trouble. You work hard, you will be treated fairly. You cause problems, you go back to the main camp and someone else takes your place. Understood?" The prisoners nodded. They had learned quickly that work details were better than sitting idle in the camp. Anything was better than the crushing boredom of captivity. Bill Hayes gestured toward the barn. "All right then. Let us see what you are made of." That was when Carl first saw her. She came walking out of the barn, leading a horse, her hair tied back with a bandana, her shirt dusty from morning chores. She could not have been more than 19 or 20. She stopped when she saw the prisoners, her hand tightening on the horse's lead. Her father said something to her Carl could not hear. She shook her head. Then she looked directly at the group of German soldiers standing awkwardly in her yard, and Carl saw something in her face he had not expected. Not hatred, not fear. Just a kind of wary assessment, like she was measuring them against some internal standard. Her name was Margaret Hayes, Maggie to everyone who knew her. She had grown up on this ranch, learned to ride before she could properly walk, and had been running the day-to-day operations since her brothers left for war. She was, Carl would learn, tougher than half the cowboys her father employed, and twice as stubborn. She also had opinions about having German prisoners working her family's land, and she was not shy about expressing them. That first day, she barely looked at them. The prisoners were divided into groups and given tasks, fence mending, mostly. The constant battle against wire that snapped in the heat and posts that rotted in the wet season. Carl found himself assigned to a section of the east pasture with 3 other prisoners and one of the ranch hands, an older cowboy named Ray, who spoke almost no German and seemed content to communicate through gestures and demonstrations. They worked in silence, the sun hammering down, the prairie stretching away in every direction. By noon, Carl's hands were blistered and his back ached. But there was something almost meditative about the work. Dig a post hole, set the post, string the wire, move to the next section. It was simple, honest. It required no ideology, no hatred, no grand cause, just labor. And in that simplicity, Carl found a strange kind of peace. They broke for lunch under the shade of a massive live oak. Ray handed out sandwiches, thick slabs of ham on bread that seemed impossibly soft and white. Carl bit into his and nearly wept. He had forgotten food could taste like this. The other prisoners ate quickly, barely speaking, as if afraid the food would be taken away. Ray watched them with something like sympathy. "You boys been hungry a while," he said. It was not a question. That afternoon, something happened that Carl would remember for the rest of his life. They were working near the southern fence line when one of the prisoners, a man named Friedrich, suddenly shouted in German. Carl looked up to see a calf, probably only a few months old, tangled in a section of broken wire. The calf was thrashing, panicked, the wire cutting deeper into its leg with every movement. Blood darkened its hide. Friedrich was already running toward it, but Ray grabbed his arm. Hold on! You will spook it worse." But the calf was screaming. That terrible sound young cattle make when they are hurt and afraid. And then, seemingly from nowhere, Maggie Hayes appeared on horseback, moving at a gallop across the field. She dismounted before the horse had fully stopped, pulling work gloves from her back pocket. "Easy," she was saying to the calf, her voice low and steady. "Easy now. Nobody's going to hurt you." She knelt in the dirt, ignoring the thrashing hooves, and began carefully working the wire free. But the calf was too frightened, too hurt. It kicked hard, catching Maggie in the shoulder and knocking her backward. Carl did not think. He just moved. He dropped his tools and ran forward, positioning himself between Maggie and the calf. He began talking, soft and low, in German. The same sounds his grandfather had used with nervous horses back in Bavaria. Steady sounds, calming sounds. The calf's eyes rolled, but the thrashing slowed. Carl reached out slowly, got a hand on the calf's neck, and held firm. Maggie was back on her feet in an instant. She did not thank him. She just nodded once and went back to work on the wire. Together, without speaking, they freed the calf. It stumbled away on shaking legs, and Maggie stood, breathing hard, blood from the wire on her gloves. She looked at Carl, really looked at him, not at a German soldier, not at a prisoner, just at a man who had helped save an animal without being asked. "Thank you," she said. Carl did not know what to say, so he said the only English words he was sure of. "You are welcome." And in that moment, under the brutal Texas sun, with a frightened calf limping away and blood on both their hands, something shifted. The barbed wire was still there. The war was still raging. But for just a moment, they had been two people working toward the same goal. And that, Carl would realize much later, was the beginning of everything. The weeks that followed the incident with the calf changed the rhythm of Carl's captivity. He was still a prisoner. The guards still came each morning to transport the work detail to the Hayes Ranch. He still returned each evening to Camp Swift, to the barbed wire and the guard towers and the rows of identical barracks. But the days themselves became something different. They became a kind of life. It started with language. Maggie Hayes seemed to have appointed herself his English teacher, though she never said so explicitly. She would ride past where he was working and pause, pointing at tools or animals or pieces of the landscape. "Fence post," she would say, "wire cutters, mesquite tree, longhorn." Carl would repeat the words, his German accent turning them strange, and she would correct him patiently. "Not longhorn." "Longhorn, one word." He tried again. She nodded. "Better." The other cowboys found this amusing. Ray, the older ranch hand, started doing it too, though his teaching method was less structured. He would hand Carl a tool and say its name, then immediately put him to work using it. That is how Carl learned. The difference between a shovel and a spade, between a halter and a bridle, between dozens of pieces of equipment that all looked vaguely similar to his untrained eye. The work itself became the classroom. By late October of 1943, Carl could understand basic instructions without a translator. By November, he was speaking in simple sentences. The other prisoners who came on the work detail noticed. Some were jealous. Others asked him to teach them. But most remained separate, doing their work in silence, counting the days until they could go home. Carl was counting something else, the moments when Maggie Hayes would ask him a question, and he would understand enough to answer. The ranch operated on a rhythm dictated by the cattle and the seasons. There were good days and hard days, but every day required work. Fences always needed mending. Cattle always needed water. In the winter months, they hauled hay to the herds. In spring, they helped with calving, which meant long nights checking on pregnant cows and pulling breech calves when necessary. Carl had never done any of this before. His family in Hamburg had owned a small shop, not a farm. But he learned quickly because he had no choice, and because the work gave him a purpose that captivity had stripped away. The meals were where the real connection happened. The Geneva Convention required that prisoners receive adequate food, but Bill Hayes interpreted adequate generously. The prisoners ate the same meals as the ranch hands, big breakfasts of eggs and bacon and biscuits, midday dinners of beans and cornbread, suppers of beef stew or fried chicken. And it was at these meals, sitting at long tables in the ranch kitchen or under the shade of the live oak, that conversations began to happen. At first, they were simple exchanges. "How is your family? Do you have brothers? Where did you grow up?" But gradually, they deepened. Maggie told Carl about her brothers fighting overseas, about her fear every time a telegram arrived, about the strange guilt of being safe while others suffered. Carl told her about Hamburg, about the bombing raids that had started before he was captured, about the last letter from his mother that had reached him months ago, about not knowing if his family was alive or dead. These conversations were dangerous in ways that had nothing to do with military regulations. They made the enemy human. They created empathy where propaganda had insisted only hatred should exist. But they kept happening anyway, Because both Carl and Maggie were discovering that the person in front of them bore no resemblance to the monster described in newspapers and radio broadcasts. The barriers, however, were everywhere, real and enormous. Carl was a prisoner of war. Maggie was the daughter of his captor's ally. Even speaking to each other outside of work instructions was technically fraught. The guards who transported the prisoners each day watched carefully for any signs of fraternization. The military regulations were clear. Prisoners were laborers, not guests. Relationships between prisoners and American civilians were forbidden. Then there was Maggie's father. Bill Hayes was not a cruel man, but he was a practical one. His sons were fighting Germans in Europe. The news from the front was brutal. The Battle of the Bulge in the winter of 1944 would kill thousands. How could he allow his daughter to befriend the enemy? He said as much one evening when he found Maggie and Carl talking near the barn. Margaret, kitchen, now. His tone left no room for argument. Carl heard their voices through the window, raised voices, Bill saying something about propriety and loyalty and what people would think. Maggie's voice, calmer but firm, saying he is not the enemy, Daddy. He is just a boy far from home. Bill's response was sharp. He is a German soldier. Your brothers are fighting German soldiers. Maggie's reply was quiet, but Carl heard it clearly. Then maybe we should ask why. The conversation ended there. But nothing was resolved. Bill Hayes did not forbid Maggie from speaking to the prisoners. He could not really. She was running the ranch. She had to give instructions, coordinate work, manage the operation. But a new tension entered the air, an awareness that they were being watched. The other prisoners noticed too. One of them, a former Wehrmacht officer named Werner, pulled Carl aside one evening on the truck ride back to camp. You are playing a dangerous game, he said in German. She is the enemy. When the war ends, we go home. Do not forget that. Carl did not answer. But Werner's words stayed with him, because Werner was right. The war would end. They would be sent home. Whatever this thing growing between him and Maggie was, it had no future. Yet it kept growing anyway. Through the winter of 1943 into 1944, through the spring calving season, through the brutal summer heat, Carl learned more than just English on the Hayes Ranch. He learned about American ideas, about democracy and freedom and the value placed on individual choice. These were not abstract concepts in textbooks. They were lived realities. He saw it in the way the cowboys treated each other, with respect regardless of rank. He saw it in the way Bill Hayes ran his ranch, making decisions based on what worked rather than what authority dictated. He saw it in Maggie herself, a woman doing work that in Germany would have been considered unthinkable for her gender, and doing it with skill and confidence. Maggie, in turn, learned about the Germany that existed beneath the Nazi regime. Carl told her about his neighborhood in Hamburg, about the Jewish families who had lived next door until they disappeared one night in 1938, about his father, who had spoken against the party and been visited by the Gestapo, about ordinary people who had watched their country transform into something they barely recognized. This is not what we wanted, he told her once. We did not choose this. She asked him the question that Americans were asking everywhere. Then why did you fight? Carl was quiet for a long time. Then he said, because if you do not, they shoot you. Because your family disappears. Because you are 20 years old and you have a rifle in your hands and orders in your ears and you do what you are told because the alternative is death. It was not a justification, just an explanation. Maggie nodded slowly. That must be a terrible way to live. It was, Carl said simply. The letters from home, when they came, told their own story. Carl received one in March of 1944. It had taken 4 months to reach him, passed through censors and across oceans. His mother's handwriting was shaky. She wrote about food shortages, about the bombing raids that came every night, about neighbors killed, homes destroyed. She wrote, "We are so hungry, Carl. We eat potato peels." She wrote, "If you are alive, stay where you are. There is nothing here for you." The letter ended, "I love you, my son. Do not come back to this." Carl showed the letter to Maggie. He did not know why, perhaps because she was the only person who might understand. She read it slowly, her German halting but functional. When she finished, she had tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry," she said. Carl shook his head. "Do not be sorry. Just help me understand. How can your country have so much while mine has so little? How is this possible?" Maggie did not have an answer, but the question hung between them. The abundance of America, the desperation of Germany, the full barns and the empty stomachs, the reality that Carl, a prisoner, ate better than his mother, a free woman. The mathematics of the war were becoming clear. Germany could not win. It was not about courage or willpower. It was about resources. And America had resources Germany could not match. The moment that changed everything happened in June of 1944. A summer storm rolled in fast the way they do in Texas, the sky turning green-black in minutes. The cattle panicked. A section of fence went down in the wind, and suddenly 200 head of cattle were loose and running, spooked by thunder that sounded like artillery. Everyone available, prisoners and cowboys alike, mounted horses and rode out to bring them back. Carl had learned to ride adequately by then, though he was no cowboy. He rode alongside Ray, chasing a group of steers that had broken south toward a ravine. The rain came down in sheets, lightning split the sky. Carl's horse slipped in the mud, nearly throwing him, but he held on, following Ray's lead, turning the cattle back toward the main herd. That was when he saw Maggie. She was chasing a group of cows that had split off toward a dry creek bed, now filling rapidly with runoff. She was riding hard, her horse at full gallop, and then, as Carl watched in horror, her horse stepped into a hidden hole. The animal went down. Maggie went flying, hitting the ground hard. Carl did not hesitate. He drove his horse toward her at a dead run, slid from the saddle before the horse had fully stopped. Maggie was on her back, the wind knocked out of her, trying to breathe. Her horse was thrashing, trying to stand on a leg that was clearly broken. The cattle were still running. The storm was still raging. And Carl made a choice. He knelt beside Maggie, checking her for injuries the way he had learned in basic training. "Can you move? Can you breathe?" She nodded, gasping. Just had the wind knocked out. Her horse screamed a terrible sound. Maggie's face crumpled. "Oh no. Oh, Daisy, no." Carl looked at the horse. He knew what had to be done. He had seen it before, in the war, with wounded horses. But he could not do it. He had no gun, no authority, no right. Bill Hayes arrived then, riding through the rain, and saw everything in an instant. His daughter on the ground, her horse ruined, and a German prisoner kneeling beside her. For a moment, nobody moved. Then Bill dismounted. "Margaret, are you hurt?" She shook her head. "Just bruised." "Daddy, Daisy." "I know, sweetheart. I know." He pulled a pistol from his belt, walked to the horse, and ended its suffering with one shot that echoed across the plains. The silence that followed was heavy. Bill helped Maggie to her feet. Then he turned to Carl. "You stayed with her. You could have run. Storm like this, you could have been gone." Carl met his eyes. "Where would I go?" Bill Hayes studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Get on back. We have cattle to round up." That night, after the storm had passed and the cattle were accounted for, and Carl was back in Camp Swift, he sat on his bunk and realized something fundamental had shifted. He had not run. He had not even considered running, because running would have meant leaving her. And somewhere along the way, without quite meaning to, Carl Schneider had stopped being a German soldier, counting the days until he could go home. He had become something else entirely, a man who had found a reason to stay. But knowing something and being able to act on it were different things entirely. Through the fall and winter of 1944 into 1945, Carl existed in a strange limbo. He worked the ranch 6 days a week. He learned to rope cattle with something approaching competence. He spent evenings in the camp teaching other prisoners English, sharing what he had learned. And every moment he was not working, he was thinking about Maggie Hayes and the impossible mathematics of their situation. They had never spoken of it directly, never named what was happening between them. How could they? Every conversation was potentially observed. Every moment together was technically a violation of regulations, and beyond the military rules, there were social realities that could not be ignored. This was Texas in 1945. A German prisoner and an American, rancher's daughter. The scandal alone could destroy her reputation, ruin her family's standing in the community. Yet the connection deepened anyway. In the way she saved him the largest biscuit at breakfast, in the way he always volunteered for the hardest jobs so she would not have to do them. In the way they could communicate with a glance across the ranch yard, a whole conversation happening in silence. The other prisoners noticed, the cowboys noticed, and Bill Hayes definitely noticed, though he said nothing. He just watched, his expression unreadable, as his daughter and the German prisoner moved around each other with the careful choreography of two people trying desperately not to touch. Then came May of 1945, and everything changed. The news reached Camp Swift on a Tuesday morning. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Carl heard it from one of the guards during breakfast formation. "Unconditional surrender," the guard said. "Hitler is dead. It is finished." Around him, prisoners reacted in different ways. Some wept, some stood in shocked silence. A few cheered, grateful simply that the dying was done. Carl felt nothing, just a strange numbness, as if his body understood something his mind had not yet processed. They were still loaded onto trucks and taken to the Hayes Ranch. Work did not stop because a war ended. The cattle still needed tending. But the atmosphere had changed. There was a tension in the air, a sense that the world was shifting beneath their feet, and no one quite knew what would come next. Maggie found Carl in the east pasture around midday. He was repairing a gate, his hands moving automatically through familiar motions. She stood watching him for a moment before she spoke. "Did you hear?" He nodded without looking up. "My country is defeated." "Yes, I heard." She moved closer. "Carl, what happens now?" That was the question, was it not? What happened now? He set down his tools and finally met her eyes. "We go home. That is what happens. We are processed and sent back to Germany." She was quiet for a moment. "When?" He shrugged. "Weeks, maybe. Months. I do not know." The silence stretched between them. Then Maggie said, "What if you did not go?" Carl laughed, but there was no humor in it. "I am a prisoner of war, Maggie. I do not get to choose." "Yes, you do," she said. Her voice was steady, but he could hear the tremor beneath it. "You could stay, marry me, become a citizen. People do it. It is possible." Carl stared at her. She was serious, completely serious, and in that moment he wanted it more than he had ever wanted anything. But want and possibility were different countries. "Maggie, I cannot. It is not legal. Prisoners cannot just stay. Even if I could, what about your family? Your father would never allow it. What about your neighbors, your community? They would call you a traitor for loving the enemy." "I do not care what they call me," Maggie said fiercely, "and my father will accept it because he has to. Because I am 22 years old and I make my own choices." She stepped closer. "Carl, I have watched you for almost 2 years. I have seen how you work, how you treat people, how you never complain even when the work is brutal. I have seen you help animals and teach other men and laugh at cowboy jokes you barely understand. I have seen who you are, and I do not care what uniform you wore or what country you fought for. I care about you." Carl felt something break open in his chest. "I care about you too," he said quietly. "More than I should. More than is wise. But Maggie, even if we wanted this, even if your father agreed, the law does not allow it. I will be sent back. There's no choice here." "Then we will find a way," Maggie said. "We will write letters. We will wait. When the rules change, when you can apply to return, I will sponsor you. We will do whatever it takes." She took his hand, right there in the open pasture where anyone could see. "I'm not letting you go without a fight." Carl looked down at their joined hands. Her skin was rough from work, scarred and calloused, beautiful. He thought about Hamburg, about his mother's last letter describing hunger and bombs. He thought about Texas, about wide skies and full tables, and a woman who looked at him and saw a man worth keeping. And he thought about the impossibility of it all. The repatriation process began in earnest in June of 1945. Officers from the War Department arrived at Camp Swift with stacks of paperwork and long lists of names. Prisoners were called in groups to processing centers where they filled out forms, answered questions, and received instructions. The plan was clear. All German prisoners of war would be returned to Germany. The timeline was aggressive. Most would be gone by the end of the year. Karl learned the details from other prisoners who had already been processed. They would be shipped back to Europe, probably to France or Britain first, then transported into occupied Germany. From there, they would be released to make their own way home, if home still existed, if their families still existed. The uncertainty was crushing. Letters from Germany painted a grim picture. Karl had received 2 more from his mother. The first described conditions in Hamburg after the British firebombing. Their neighborhood was gone, just rubble and ashes. They were living in a basement with 6 other families. Food was scarce. His mother weighed less than 90 pounds. The second letter was worse. His father had died. Malnutrition and pneumonia. There had been no medicine, no doctor, just a death certificate from the British occupation authorities. Karl held that letter in his hands and tried to imagine going back to that, to a city of ruins, to a mother who was starving, to a country occupied by foreign soldiers. What future was there? What life? He would be another displaced person among millions, scrambling for food, for work, for any kind of survival. And yet, it was his home, his country. His mother needed him. But Maggie had said, "Marry me." And that offer, impossible as it seemed, had planted itself in his mind like a seed. The legal reality was complicated. Prisoners of war could not simply stay in the United States. They had to be repatriated. That was the law. But there were rumors, whispers among the prisoners, of men who had found ways around the rules. If a prisoner married an American citizen, they said, it created complications. If a prisoner could prove extreme hardship in returning, maybe. If a prisoner had valuable skills, perhaps they could apply for special immigration status later. But these were just rumors, unconfirmed stories, hope shaped like smoke. Karl was called for processing in July of 1945. He sat in a room with a bored-looking officer who went through a checklist of questions: name, rank, service record, family status, destination in Germany, any special concerns. When asked about family, Karl told the truth. His father was dead. His mother was alive but in poor health. His home was destroyed. The officer made notes without looking up. "A lot of that going around," he said flatly. "You will be assigned to a transport ship, probably September, maybe October, next." And just like that, Karl's future was decided. Except it was not decided. Not yet. He told Maggie that evening. They had started taking walks after supper, short ones, always within sight of the ranch house, always technically proper, but alone enough to talk. When he told her about the processing, about the transport ship in September, she stopped walking. "So that is it? You just give up?" "I am not giving up," Karl said. "I am facing reality. Maggie, they are sending me back. That is the law. I cannot fight the law." She turned to face him. "What if we got married now, before you leave? Would that change anything?" Karl wanted to say yes. He wanted to believe it would make a difference, but he had asked around. He had talked to other prisoners, to guards who were sympathetic, even to one of the camp administrators. The answer was always the same. Marriage would not prevent repatriation. The law was clear. "It would not stop them from sending me back," he told her gently. "And it would make everything harder for you. People would say terrible things. Your father would be furious." "No, Karl. My father knows," I told him. "Everything." Karl felt his heart stop. "You told him?" Maggie nodded. "I had to. I could not keep lying, keep hiding. So I told him I love you and I want to marry you and I do not care what anyone thinks." There was a long pause. "What did he say?" Maggie smiled, though her eyes were wet. "He said you are a damn fool and so am I." And then he said, "If you are going to be stupid, at least be smart about it." Karl did not understand. "What does that mean?" "It means," Maggie said, "that he will help. He has been talking to a lawyer. There might be a way. If you go back to Germany and then apply to immigrate legally, as a citizen, not a prisoner, he will sponsor you, give you a job offer, a reason to be approved. It will take time, maybe years, but it is possible." Karl felt hope flare, painful and bright. "And you would wait?" Years? For something that might not even work? Maggie took both his hands. "I've already been waiting, Carl." Was a little longer. So they made a plan. Carl would return to Germany as required by law. He would help his mother get her settled somewhere safe, and then he would apply to immigrate to the United States through legal channels. Bill Hayes would provide a letter of employment. Maggie would write to him, help navigate the bureaucracy from the American side, and they would wait, however long it took. It was not the ending Carl wanted, but it was the only one possible. And in August of 1945, standing in that same processing center where he had first held repatriation papers, Carl made his choice. He signed the forms, accepted the transport assignment, and promised Maggie Hayes that he would come back. Not as a prisoner, but as a free man who had chosen Texas over everything else. The officer processing him looked at the papers and then at Carl. "You are returning to Hamburg?" "Yes, sir." The officer made a note. "Tough city. A lot of destruction there." Carl nodded. "I know." The officer stamped the papers. "Good luck, son. You are going to need it." But Carl was not thinking about luck. He was thinking about a girl who had taught him to rope cattle and speak English and believe that the enemy could become something else entirely. He was thinking about a promise made under a Texas sky. And he was thinking that some wars ended with treaties and surrenders, but others ended with choices. And he had just made his. The transport ship left from New York Harbor in late September of 1945. Carl stood on the deck with hundreds of other German prisoners watching America disappear into the gray Atlantic horizon. In his pocket, he carried three things: a letter from his mother, a photograph of Maggie Hayes standing beside a horse, her hand shading her eyes from the Texas sun, and a promise written on a piece of paper in her handwriting. "I will wait. Come back to me." The crossing took 2 weeks. The ship was crowded, the food adequate but bland, the mood somber. Most of the men were silent, lost in their own thoughts about what awaited them. A few talked hopefully about reuniting with families, about rebuilding, about starting fresh. But most knew better. They were sailing back to a country that no longer existed in any recognizable form. Germany had been divided, occupied, dismantled. They were going home to ruins. The ship docked in Le Havre, France. From there, the prisoners were transported by train through a landscape of devastation. Carl had seen war. He had fought in North Africa, seen cities bombed and battles fought, but nothing prepared him for this. France was scarred, and Germany, when they finally crossed the border, was something beyond scarring. It was erasure. Entire cities reduced to rubble. Bridges collapsed into rivers, factories stripped to their foundations, people moving through the wreckage like ghosts, thin and hollow-eyed. The train stopped in Hamburg, or what remained of it. Carl stepped onto the platform and could not orient himself. Nothing looked familiar. The station was half destroyed. The streets beyond were canyons of broken brick. He asked directions from a British soldier who looked at him with weary contempt. "You German?" "Yes." The soldier pointed. "Displaced persons processing that way. Good luck." It took Carl 3 days to find his mother. She was living in what had been a schoolhouse, now converted into emergency housing for families who had lost everything. 20 people shared 4 rooms. No heat, limited electricity. Food came from British rations, barely enough to survive. When Carl finally found her, he almost walked past. The woman sitting on a narrow cot looked 70. She was 53. "Mutti," he said softly. His mother looked up. For a moment she did not recognize him. Then something shifted in her eyes. Carl. My Carl. She stood, and he saw how frail she had become. He embraced her carefully, afraid she might break. "I am home, Mutti. I am here." But home was the wrong word. This was not home. This was survival. This was waiting for the next ration card, the next meal, the next day. Carl found work with the British occupation authorities as a translator. His English, learned from Texas cowboys, amused the British officers but was functional enough. The pay was minimal, but it came with an extra ration card, enough to keep his mother fed. At night, in the cold schoolhouse, Carl wrote letters to Maggie. Long letters describing the devastation, the hunger, the sense that Germany would never recover. but also hopeful letters asking about the immigration process, about forms and sponsorships and legal requirements. Her replies took weeks to arrive, but they came, every one of them ending the same way. I am waiting. Come home, home. It was not Germany, not anymore. Home was Texas. Home was a ranch with cattle stretching to the horizon. Home was a woman who believed in him when the world had called him the enemy. The legal process was Byzantine. Former prisoners of war could not simply return to the United States. They had to apply through normal immigration channels. There were quotas, restrictions, waiting lists that stretched for years. But there were also provisions for skilled workers, for people with American sponsors, for those who could prove they would contribute to society rather than burden it. Bill Hayes wrote letters to senators, to immigration officials, to anyone who might help. He provided documentation that Carl had worked his ranch, that he had skills in animal husbandry and ranch management, that there was a job waiting for him. Maggie gathered affidavits from neighbors who remembered Carl, from cowboys who had worked alongside him. She filled out forms and submitted applications and fought bureaucracy with stubborn determination. It took 3 years of Carl living in occupied Hamburg, working for British officers, caring for his mother, and writing letters to a woman he feared he might never see again. 3 years of Maggie refusing every man who asked to court her, running the ranch alongside her father, and waiting for immigration approvals that seemed like they would never come. Then, in the spring of 1948, a letter arrived that changed everything. Carl's application had been approved. He had been granted an immigration visa to the United States. Not as a prisoner, as a resident, as someone choosing America freely. The voyage back across the Atlantic felt different. Carl traveled on a passenger ship, not a military transport. He had proper papers, a visa, a future. When he saw the Statue of Liberty rising from New York Harbor, he stood on the deck and wept, not for Germany, not for what he had lost, but for what he had somehow, impossibly, gained. The train to Texas took 3 days. Carl watched America roll past his window and remembered seeing it for the first time through prison bars. Now there were no bars, no guards, just landscape and possibility. When the train pulled into Austin, Maggie was waiting on the platform. She saw him through the window and started running before the train had fully stopped. They collided in an embrace that nearly knocked them both over. Carl lifted her off her feet, buried his face in her hair, and said the words he had been practicing for 3 years. I came home. I told you I would come home. Maggie was laughing and crying at the same time. I knew you would. I never doubted. They married 2 weeks later in a small ceremony at the ranch. Bill Hayes walked his daughter down a makeshift aisle between hay bales. The local pastor performed the service. A handful of ranch hands attended, along with some neighbors brave enough to come. Because it was brave. Marrying a former enemy soldier, even 3 years after the war, was still controversial. There were people in town who called Maggie a traitor, who said Bill Hayes should be ashamed, who muttered that German prisoners should have stayed in Germany where they belonged. But there were others who remembered Carl from his time working the ranch, who had seen him help during emergencies, who had shared meals with him, who recognized that the uniform did not define the man. Ray, the old cowboy who had taught Carl to mend fences, stood up at the ceremony and said simply, "This boy is one of us now. Anyone got a problem with that can answer to me." It was not much, but it was enough. Building a life was harder than Carl had anticipated. He knew ranching, he knew cattle, but knowing and belonging were different things. Some neighbors refused to do business with Bill Hayes because he employed a German. Some women in town would not speak to Maggie. The local Veterans Association initially denied Carl's application to join community events, saying only American veterans qualified. Never mind that he was now an American resident working toward citizenship. But Carl had learned patience during 3 years of bureaucracy and waiting. He worked the ranch, kept his head down, and proved himself through actions rather than words. When a neighbor's barn caught fire, Carl was the first one there, hauling water and saving livestock. When another rancher lost cattle to a flash flood, Carl spent 3 days helping round them up. Slowly, grudgingly, the community began to accept him, not as a German, just as Carl, the guy who worked the Hayes Ranch and never caused trouble. Citizenship came in 1951. Carl stood in a courtroom in Austin with dozens of other immigrants, raised his right hand, and swore allegiance to the United States of America. He meant every word. This was his country now. By choice, by love, by the sweat he had poured into Texas soil. The children came next. William, named after Maggie's father, born in 1952. Then Margaret, called Maggie like her mother, born in 1954. And finally Thomas, born in 1957. 3 children who grew up on the ranch, learning to ride before they could walk, speaking English without an accent, but hearing their father's stories about Hamburg and war and the strange journey that had brought him here. Carl never hid his past. He told his children about Germany, about fighting in a war he had not believed in, about being captured and becoming a prisoner. And he told them about kindness, about cowboys who had treated him like a man instead of an enemy, about their mother who had seen past the uniform to the person beneath, about how hatred could be overcome by simple human decency. Contact with Germany remained limited. Carl's mother died in 1951 before she could visit America. He had sent her money when he could, letters describing his new life, photographs of his wedding and children. She had written back saying she was proud of him, that she understood his choice, that Texas sounded like a dream. When she died, Carl grieved. But he did not regret his decision. She had told him herself, "Do not come back. There is nothing here for you." What Carl had lost was his homeland, the place of his birth, the language of his childhood, the culture and history that had shaped his early years. He would never see Hamburg again, never walk the streets where he had grown up, never visit his father's grave. He carried Germany inside him, a memory that faded a little more with each passing year until it became something distant and dreamlike. But what he had gained was everything else: a wife who loved him, children who called him Dad in English, a ranch that felt more like home than Hamburg ever had, freedom to speak his mind without fear, prosperity built through honest work, a community that slowly and imperfectly had accepted him, and most importantly, dignity. The dignity of being judged for who he was rather than what flag he had once served. Carl's story was not unique. Across America, dozens, perhaps hundreds of former German prisoners had followed similar paths. They had returned to Germany as required, then immigrated back legally. They married American women, they became citizens. They built businesses, raised families, and integrated into communities that had once viewed them as enemies. Each story was a small victory over propaganda and hatred. Each marriage was a bridge between nations. The German government initially viewed these men as traitors, men who had abandoned their homeland. But as the years passed and West Germany rebuilt, attitudes shifted. These former prisoners became informal ambassadors. They sent money back to struggling relatives. They facilitated business connections. They proved that Germans and Americans could not just coexist, but thrive together. The economic miracle of West Germany in the 1950s and 60s was built partly on Marshall Plan aid, but it was also built on changed perceptions, on the realization that America was not the enemy Nazi propaganda had described. Carl lived to see Berlin Wall fall in 1989. He watched on television, tears streaming down his face as Germans celebrated reunification. His children, now adults with children of their own, sat with him. "Dad," his daughter asked, "do you ever wish you had gone back?" Carl was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I did go back, and then I chose to leave. That was my freedom, to choose." By the time Carl Schneider died in 2003 at the age of 80, he had been an American citizen for 52 years, longer than he had ever been a German soldier. His funeral was held at the same church where he had married Maggie 55 years earlier. The chapel was full. Cowboys and ranchers, neighbors and friends, his 3 children and 7 grandchildren. The obituary in the local paper described him simply: Carl Schneider, beloved husband, father, and rancher, veteran of World War II, American by choice. His grandchildren would grow up hearing the story about the German prisoner who fell in love with a Texas rancher's daughter, about how 2 people from opposite sides of a war had built a life together, about how humanity could triumph over hatred if given the chance. They would learn that their grandfather had once been called the enemy, and they would learn that labels like enemy and ally were less important than character and choice. The Hayes Ranch still operates today, now run by Carl and Maggie's grandson. On the wall of the ranch office hangs a photograph, a young man in a faded prison uniform standing next to a young woman in cowboy boots. They are both smiling, squinting into the Texas sun. Beneath the photo is a small plaque, Carl and Margaret Schneider, 1948, proof that love is stronger than war. Because in the end, that was the real victory. Not the battles won or treaties signed, but the quiet defeat of propaganda through human connection, the realization that enemies were just people who had been taught to hate. And when that teaching was overcome, when dignity replaced cruelty and kindness replaced fear, something remarkable happened. Former enemies became neighbors, prisoners became citizens, and a German soldier became a Texas rancher who taught his grandchildren that freedom was not where you were born. It was what you chose to become. Carl Schneider chose Texas, and Texas, slowly and imperfectly, but ultimately completely, chose him back. That choice, multiplied across hundreds of similar stories, helped heal wounds that weapons could never close. It built bridges that diplomacy could never construct. And it proved that sometimes the greatest weapon against hatred is simply seeing the humanity in the person standing across from you, even when everything tells you they are the enemy. Especially then.